Welcome to Your Idaho, brought to you by the Gem State Patriot. My name is Bob Neugebauer. My guest today is former Senator and Gubernatorial candidate Russ Fulcher. We've asked Russ to join us here today so that we could discuss his announcement to run for governor in 2018 and how he plans to change the course of Idaho. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
I want to thank you
for having me on.
Thank you for taking the time for coming down here. I know you have a very busy schedule, especially now that you're running for governor again.
We're in the race.
And we're here to try and get some insight into what you envision is the future for this great state. Now that we know you came very close to winning in a 2014 primary against Governor Otter with 43% of the vote, which was quite an achievement going up against a two-term incumbent who has been in Idaho politics for 30 years. Do you see yourself going in the same direction as you did the last time?
Yeah, the core principles that we ran on in 2014 will still be in place. And unlike that time, we actually have some time this time, Bob, and we've got a network that we were able to build in 2014 across the state. We got to know a lot of people. We got to meet a lot of people. We got to increase our reach with our database, and so we just feel like we're in a much better position now. But the core principles that we stood on in 2014, we're going to run on in 2018 too.
So basically, you're going to be there with the economy as, I would think, your most important topic. Healthcare would probably be a primary also. What would be a third one?
Education.
Okay.
And they all intermingle, as you know. But and all of that under the kind of the umbrella viewpoint that the government is not the solution on a lot of this. The government is the problem on a lot of this. And so how do we best level a playing field and create an environment to where the private citizens and our private companies can be successful and really provide the answers that we need long term?
Well, let's start off here. There was a recent article out of the Twin Falls newspaper that touted as its title, "Little Talks Trump Governing Philosophy," which kind of caught my eye. Now, I find it hard to digest because Brad Little has been an Otter acolyte for 8 years, and 8 years prior to that being in the legislature. And Butch is not anything like a Donald Trump, so I don't know where they're coming from with this particular article. But I want to, and I know something about the past history of Trump because I actually did work years ago with him. Idaho has had a very small recovery since the recession of 2008, 2009. Median household income has risen, but we still find ourselves way behind the national average. And although we have seen slight improvement economically in the past year, people here are still struggling to make ends meet with much higher health insurance costs, higher gas taxes, which were put through last year, higher property taxes. It seems like they're getting hit from every angle. And although we see unemployment at a little more than 3% in the state, we find that many of our workers are having to take 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. And I should also note that we've moved from second highest minimum wage of jobs to state number 5 in the number 5 in the highest number of minimum wage jobs. So we moved up 3 notches. Where is that getting us? I mean, we're not going anyplace. What would you try to do to change? And I know this is a lot to cover, but these are the problems.
Sure. Yeah, Bob, it is a big issue, probably the issue that we'll have to address throughout the campaign. And to try to just summarize, it's a function of a service-based economy, and I'm not knocking a service-based economy, but when you have that many minimum wage jobs, and that a large percentage of the population who have to have multiple jobs to try to make ends meet, they're paying little, and they tend to be service in nature. And there's a lot of great service jobs. Again, I'm not knocking that, but the bottom line is the higher paying jobs are the ones that are resource-based, manufacturing-based, and Idaho is a perfect state to harbor that. So in essence, what's happening is we're starving to death in a room full of food. We have fabulous natural resources. We have fabulous human resources. We have all the potential in the world, but the environment to allow that to prosper is being hindered by government. We have quite a high tax burden, and there are so many regulations that we can't leverage the resource base that's truly under our feet. And so I think the best thing that government can do is to try to create that environment so that people have access to their resources and they can exploit in a very positive way, in a very well-managed way, some of the great blessings that we have with our natural resources in the state of Idaho. And that, by the way, does not mean that we sell everything off privately and that we don't allow access. None of that. We need to just be much wiser on how we manage our resources, open up that access, encourage things other than service-based jobs.
So I know we have about 70% of our economy here is service-based. And it never used to be that way. If you go back into the 80s, 90s, we had a lot of jobs in mining and in the wood industry and the timber industry. That's all gone, and a lot of this has to do with the government basically controlling 62% of our land in Idaho. Yeah, the federal government. Mm-hmm. And they don't pay us enough to offset what it cost us for our education or what we could take out of there in terms of minerals. However, they do let it burn. They don't care about that. That's all right.
It's kind of the worst of all worlds, because when you don't allow appropriate management, it fosters things like wildfires and forest fires, and that is bad for the environment because all this carbon is getting kicked up into the air. It's bad for the economy because the jobs in some of those industries that are related to it can't be had, and it's bad for the federal government because the tax revenue they would typically see out of that economy is not realized. So it's really, the current system is kind of a lose-lose-lose scenario.
I don't want you to give any secrets away, but can you tell us what your plan would be to revive Idaho's economy should you become governor in 2018? Where would you start, and what would be the first things you change?
Maybe a way to answer that question is to tell a brief story. And this is a true story, and I will not use real names, but I would say about 3-4 years ago, I happen to know an individual based out of California that is one of very few people across our nation that has responsibility for citing major companies, major organizations, and locating them around the world. I'm talking about, like a Ford Motor Company or General Motors or a Microsoft. And so I asked a favor of this individual, and I said, I'll call him Fred. His name's not Fred, but I'll say, Fred, sometime when you're 30,000 feet over Idaho, I want you to touch down. I want you to spend a couple hours, and you tell me in advance, and I'll get anybody that you want in the state. But I want to talk economic development in Idaho. And long story short, he did. And I said, who do you want there? And he says, I just want 2 people. I want your superintendent of public instruction, and I want your director of commerce. Okay, so we did that. So actually it was the 4 of us in the room, and we sat down, and he skipped all the pleasantries, and he pointed to our superintendent of public instruction. I'll call him Joe. He said, Joe, this is our director of commerce, and I'll call him Jim. Jim, you guys need to get married. And here's what I mean by that. What I do as a large business industry placement individual is all I do is I match a workforce with the industry. And if you get me that workforce, this is not rocket science. You will have the industry that comes with it. But you have to be able to provide that. Now, that was a simplistic summary of a long conversation, and it's something that we all knew, but it drove the point home to me, is that, look, if we want to be in the medical field and we want to grow that industry, then we need to be able to provide that type of a workforce. If it's in technology, it's tech. If it's automotive, it's automotive. Can't be all things to all people, so we have to be smart about that and work with our schools and our education leaders to do it. But that's one big part, Bob, and that's just one simple component. The other thing is what we referenced earlier. It's tax policy. We cannot burden people so heavily that they have to climb that mountain every day with a 100-pound pack on their back. So there's a tax policy component, and so if you combine those things, if you nurture and focus your education system to where you're putting out a quality product, if you lower your tax burden and you restructure that, simplify it, and you couple that with providing some wise access to the natural resource base that God gave us, Idaho has got an incredible potential. And is it simple? No. Is it quick or easy? No. Can it be done? Absolutely. That's where we need to go.
Well, knowing what I know about our resource base, I've only been here for 24 years, but I've seen what happened prior to with the sawmills going out of business and what have you, timber industry going down the drain. So, we're actually looking in other areas now to find a way to bring more people to the state, bring more business to the state. But when you try to merge the education system with the commerce that goes on here, how would you do that? I mean, do you change? Right now we've been having this shift from local boards making a lot of decisions for the schools, and they've been taking it more on a state level. And this has been a shift that's been going on here for 5 years, maybe 10 years. And it's not a good shift because I believe local control is much more important, especially when you get into the more rural areas. And the fact that we have less vocational instruction in our educational system now than we've had before. And if you're going to get, kind of like Germany, when Germany set their program up, they take the kids in their freshman and sophomore year and they start teaching them about trades if they're interested, so that they will have the ability to go out and work, be in the workforce when they graduate. We don't seem to do that anymore. When I was in school, we used to have those vocational studies, wood shop, metal shop, machine shop, automotive. That was all part and parcel of your education. It was a very diverse education. We don't see that anymore. Everybody is concentrating on the STEM. Well, STEM is great. The problem with STEM is the HB1 visas, we take all these people in from out of the country and we bring them in here, and there's no room for our people for these STEM jobs. And believe it, I've gone through the numbers. STEM people have been increasing their salaries by no more than 2% a year, if that, over the last 5 to 10 years, because of the influx. Hewlett-Packard themselves has a policy to outsource 70% of their jobs to foreign countries. So how do you solve that problem? And how do you get companies to come here? We have a heavy tax burden, not just on the corporations, but also on the individuals. At $11,000, you start paying some pretty heavy tax.
Sure.
And the surrounding states, they don't have that same tax burden. It's not quite as bad. What would you do to solve that?
That's probably about a week's worth of conversation.
I know, and these are the problems.
There are a couple of things that come to mind. They're not simple, but there's a couple of things that come to mind that I think are principles that we could adhere to. And I'll use the northern part of our state as an example there. There is a burgeoning industry for companies that were in the manufacturing areas, but they needed workers who had some of those vocational skills for machining and for welding and some of those skills, just didn't have the skill set. So for the most part, it was all privately led. The private organizations, private companies, their leadership got together, knowing that the system wasn't turning out the base that they needed, and they facilitated a entity which is now known as KTEC. And my understanding, I have been there before, and my understanding has been incredibly successful, and it was done without government intervention. There was a need, and the private enterprise saw that need. They addressed it, and as a result, the industries have blossomed as a function of that. So that's just one idea. Right here locally in the Treasure Valley, Bob, I met just a few days ago with a CEO of a tech company that does a lot of software coding. He was lamenting on how difficult it is to get software coders, and not having the appropriate facilities here. And by the way, a good software coder does not have to get multiple jobs to live.
Right.
Okay. And so, that kind of goes to that whole need of, all right, where is the coordination with our universities? Where is the coordination with our education providers to identify, address, and offer the curriculum and the flexibility to students to attain that training for some of those jobs? And it's just simply I won't say it's not being addressed at all, because I think there's some level, but it's certainly not coordinated the way it should be.
But doesn't some of this start at the high school level? I know at the college level, because I've got 4 grandchildren who 3 are out of college and 1 is still going. But the cost to go through college burdened them so heavily. Forget the tax problem.
Well, and
back.
The colleges were probably doing some of the training the high schools and the junior highs and the elementary schools should have done.
Right. And there's a lot of remedial going on.
Right.
It takes 5 years to graduate from college now instead of the 4 years.
Okay, so here's a scenario that, again, not simple, but what's happened in our K-12 education system over the last 50 years? And I'll at least give you a perspective. We are asking our public school system to do things they were never designed to do. We are asking our public school system to, yes, educate our kids, but also feed our kids, clothe our kids, babysit our kids. In many cases, we're asking the public school system to raise our families.
A daycare center.
There has been a transition away from the family to the public school system, or government in a way, to do all these things. So what comes with that? You lose the value system and some of the integral character building environment that only comes with a family. And you transition that to a third party, which raises the cost tremendously on everyone else. So the taxpayer is trying to subsidize what the family used to do. And so we've transitioned a lot of that authority from the family to the government. It's less efficient. It's much less involved with the person, and much less effective. We've taken the cost way high for the taxpayer. We've lowered the overall quality of the service, because now the teachers can't just focus on educating for their core. They have to do all these other things. There needs to be a cultural shift over time to re-employ our families, our communities, our churches with the responsibilities that they ultimately should have as the rightful place of society, as opposed to putting that all in the back of a public school system.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but we have teachers here who are literally living at the poverty level. They actually could collect food stamps, many of them. They could be on Medicaid expansion if indeed it went through here. Don't you think that we need to start looking at our educational system in total and saying, where are we spending our money and how inefficient has it been? Because we've done a study and we have found that, and this is a guesstimate because you can't find the real numbers, it's so difficult the way they manage them, that 25 to 30% of our school budgets go to administrative costs. That's money that should be spent on teachers. You don't need that many. You got 155 school districts, including charter schools. You need to start combining some of that.
Sure. And that was where I was going to go with it. And by the way, I could be wrong, but I think the number you mentioned was low. I think it's actually higher in terms of the administrative cost. And what you said about the number of school districts, I think, is something that we have to look at. And it is emotional when you go outside of the urban areas into the rural areas, because that local high school is their identity in a lot of these small towns. And so things are just looked at differently there. But to your point, do we really need that many school districts? Do we really need that many administrations? Do we really need to to spend the amount of resources that we are administratively, and I certainly think there's an opportunity. It only gets magnified, by the way, and this by the proliferation of charter schools and that kind of thing, which I support. I absolutely support. I mean, school choice is a big component of anything that we should do. However, the administration, the taxpayer burden that comes with it, has got to be consolidated in some fashion.
Okay, I think that kind of answered most of what I wanted to get through. Healthcare is an issue we all know has been a tremendous burden on the people in Idaho. Steve Ackerman and I have been involved in this from the beginning when they first put up the state healthcare exchange, fighting against it. And we have seen the horror stories that have come out of this with people whose health insurance have doubled and tripled over the last 3 years. I mean, we told people this was going to happen, but nobody seemed to want to listen. And we're coming up again now to a situation where they want to expand Medicaid. Now, they say they're going to put 78,000 people on a rolls. In essence, the experience of most other states who have taken on Medicaid is that that number will be double or more. And I say that because it's not just those people who we recognize that are in that gap, but the ones that will be put in that gap. And I say that because the corporations who are paying people that are in that gap, all right, in that hole, will eliminate their health care plans and throw these people into Medicaid. And this has been the creation of the people from IACI here, okay? The Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry. Well, I call it the Idaho Association of Cronyism, because these people have been lobbying for 4 years. Believe me, I've been to many of these meetings. We need to change the healthcare system, which has been monopolized here. And I don't know how we're going to do it, because there are controlling factors, and it's all corporations that are controlling what's happening. How do you go about changing the healthcare system, making it more acceptable, getting the costs down, and getting the legislators to understand that you can't keep taking money from one person and giving it to others? It's got to stop.
I really like the way you identify those really simple topics.
I understand. Yes. I'm sorry, but you're going to be the governor, so we have to ask you tough questions.
And they're good questions. Just difficult to cover in any kind of detail in a short program. But it's great topic. And I, like you, I have sat through more of those types of meetings than I want. You got to go to some base principles, and one of those principles is we need to be focusing on mechanisms to put the health care in the plan of under the authority and the purview of the individual, instead of some third-party entity like an insurance company or some administrator somewhere that's detached and is on the gravy train for a series of reimbursements along the way. There's a physician in Idaho Falls, Dr. Jim Brook, who has, I think, done some things that are very creative in this sense, who's just chosen to run a practice without leveraging insurance and all the overhead and the burden of costs that come with that. So those people who come and utilize his services are paying just for that, just for those services. There is another way to help accomplish that, and with the proliferation of that, it opens up other opportunities. Bottom line is that there needs to be accountability in how you spend your money and how you get reimbursed for that. So I do like the idea of healthcare savings accounts. I do like the idea of medical memberships. I do like the idea of opening up more competition for all kinds of industry, including the insurance providers, to provide some of those options. You got to drive to those principles. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is not the answer. Taking a broken system like Medicare, Medicaid, and throwing more at that is not the answer. Bob, you and I have talked offline. I take my elderly mother to her doctor appointments. Most physicians don't even take Medicare, Medicaid.
Right.
And so if you want to use your Medicare, Medicaid, you have to go to one of the major hospital providers. And that's the least efficient system for delivery when it comes to cost. And many times it's very good care, but it's extremely expensive. So the system is broken. The system is abused. The answer is not to expand a broken system. The answer is to figure out other ways to drive the decision-making into the hands of the patient themselves.
Do you think if you became the executive leader of this state that you could talk to our legislators and actually be able to convince those who have supposedly say they're conservative to change their ways and actually understand that we have to change it, or we're going to have some serious problems?
Bob, understand where the issues are. Okay, there's a very deep, involved system in place, and that system is entrenched, and there are many stakeholders who are vested in seeing that system continue because that's how they get paid.
Well, I'll say it because you won't. You're talking about the cronyist system that we have here in government and corporations and how they intertwine all the time.
If we are going to have success in changing the system and making it more efficient, we have to be able to point out the long-term benefits of completely stepping away from a lot of the things that are entrenched right now. The long-term benefit is so much better for everyone that it simply is going to take bucking that system and being able to demonstrate the long-term benefit that everyone would enjoy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about accountability and transparency. Over the last 2 years, I've been covering the cost to taxpayers of several scandals that have taken place in Idaho, and they've started at the highest levels. One is the CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, which never had an investigation, and don't ask me why, okay, but it was never investigated. They paid us $1 million when it was probably multi-millions of dollars that they owed the state for phony hours that they used at the prison. And then we have the IEN, the Idaho Education Network, which so far we have counted up close to $40 million has cost the state, not including the lawsuits.
And counting.
And counting. It's going up. I said in the beginning this would cost us $100 million. And I do believe that's where it's going to go to at some point in time, because now the state has two legal suits against it and against literally every school district, because they're being sued by Syringa, by Educational Network, and they're being sued by CenturyTel. These are problems that nobody has taken any accountability for. We see them in the press, and then we don't see them ever again until somebody else comes up and says something about it, or another lawsuit comes up. What would you do to change that, to have some accountability? Because I don't see it here.
In any organization that I've ever been part of that's been successful, it's been a function of where leadership has the foresight and the ability to surround themselves with very good, competent talent, and then allow those individuals to function and do their job and exhibit that talent, but oversee it, be actively involved, and provide that accountability from a leadership standpoint. And I think we have fallen down in that area here because instead of perhaps having the best talent, there has been a lot of people that have come and gone, and these jobs and roles have changed, and the next thing you know, we're not following the process. There is an RFP process for IEN, for example, that didn't get appropriately followed. And this has been played out in the courts a couple times. It just didn't get appropriately followed for whatever reason. And so it starts at the top, and it starts who is our chief executive going to wrap themselves with in terms of that talent? How are they going to oversee that, hold them accountable, and are they going to follow that process? And ultimately, that's where this has to go. That doesn't mean that one person is making all these decisions. To the contrary, no, you put the right people in the agencies, you let them do their work, but you always hold them accountable to that. That's how leadership works. That's how successful organizations operate. That's what needs to happen here.
Well, let's talk about the accountability and the people you put into place, and talk about competent talent. Over the last year, we have had this, I can't say it, this, I call it cronyism, okay, where we take a legislator who has been involved for, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years, and, they're due for a pension, and all of a sudden they get levitated to the head of a bureaucratic agency within the government by the governor. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, okay? But to me, that's cronyism. That's a way for the governor to keep control of the bureaucratic process by having those people in those positions. Not only that, it has raised the cost of the pensions by phenomenal amounts, and we're talking hundreds of percents for the people that have been hired. Would you stop this process if you were governor? Would you try to change this? Because it doesn't seem like the legislature has any appetite for doing this.
Well, first of all, I'll just point out that I'm a longstanding senator. Former senator I was in a leadership role.
You never got a job, though.
I never got a job offer.
Well, because you're not tight with the gov.
Okay. Well, there's always a tendency to, or there's frequently a tendency that you want to try to do things for your friends. You want to try to do things because it's going to leverage your control over time, and it's simply bad business practice. If you, and by the way, there might be a circumstance where the best person for that job is a former legislator or whatever. So I wouldn't say that I would never do that. On the other hand, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. You have to take all that relationship stuff off the table. I mean, for the good of the state, for the good of your office, for the good of the people of Idaho, you just simply can't operate that way. It's who's the best person for that job, who's the best individual that's going to execute the responsibilities in the most efficient way. That's where those roles have to be offered.
One more question before we close this down. The legislature is only in session for 3, possibly 4 months a year, depending on what kind of a workload they have. Yet they're passing legislation at a pace that you would think they needed 6 months to do. We see well over 1,000 and 1,500 pages of new regulations coming out every year. I speak to these legislators, even some of the new ones that have just come on board. They are absolutely buried in reading bills, and I will tell you, most of them do not read these bills. They don't know what they're passing. They don't know what's going through. And I hear this all the time from the constituents. Do they actually understand what they passed? Do they understand what they've been writing? Would you consider maybe extending this session and making this more of a full-time job for our legislators who get paid a minuscule amount of money, to be very honest, compared to a lot of states. But if you're going to do a job, you need to do it properly, and you need to be compensated for it in the right way. We might actually wind up getting some better people in our legislature if we offered them better compensation and more time to actually do the job that they had been hired to do.
First of all, I think you have to understand the premise for part of that, and boy, I know what you're talking about. I mean, I lived this firsthand for 10 years, and it's not uncommon for a legislative session to deal with 1,000 different bills. Okay, and literally 1,000, 800 to 1,000 is about what I think we were running the last few years. Part of the premise and the problem there, Bob, is Idaho, like most other states, we find ourselves reacting to what is coming down from some federal level. Okay, and so a lot of that legislation is not a function of an Idaho legislator who's gone out and they decided to write new code. In most cases, it's not. We're reacting to something that comes from the federal government. That's one issue. So we got to deal with that whole federal control thing, and maybe that's a conversation for another meeting. But you got to deal with that federal control thing and right size that control balance between state and Fed. But that's one issue. But on the other hand, part of that is also cultural. And the nature of the beast and how things work in a 3-month session. The business of the people needs to be done, and it needs to be done in a competent fashion. If that means we need to extend that window of time, I'm happy to extend that window of time.
Well, I don't disagree with you in what you're saying. Okay, what I do have a problem with is that there are only 3 different types of people who I can find could actually get into the legislature and have the time to do it. 1, a business owner that has somebody else to take his place. 2, a retired person that's on their own retirement money, or somebody who is wealthy enough not to worry about having to work, because you need to take those 3 months off. That's the serious problem. You need to bring the younger people into our legislature. We have people who have been sitting in there. I think they're going to erect gravestones there at some point in time. They're never going to leave. So we need younger people to come in, but we need to motivate them with enough of a salary to make it palatable.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. By the same token, I'm also one who's not real crazy about making administrative burdens bigger. There's a couple of other things that come into play with this whole thing, though, Bob, and it goes back to what is the vision for state government? And I got to go back to a premise that we talked about earlier. Government is not the solution to a lot of these things. Government is the problem to a lot of these things. And by proliferating all these bills and all this new code, it seems like we're involved with everything. I mean, absolutely everything. I want to try to change that culture and challenge our legislators. For every bill you run, I want to see one that you repeal. Let's start taking stuff off the books, okay, and putting this back in the hands of our private industry. I'm kind of giving you a twofold answer here. One, I would like to help influence a culture change that reminds people that the power for prosperity is in the hands of the individual, not in some government agency, okay? And so don't go run a bill to achieve your means. Go do that and be successful in the private entity, and of course government has to level that playing field. But the other part of that is, look, that said, we do live in a very complicated world, and whether we like it or not, we are going to be operating in an environment where we have to deal with things the federal government throws at us. And in some cases where there's state regulation, you simply have to deal with. And if that's the circumstance, I would personally rather extend the session, and for that matter, the cost for a quality legislative force, than just simply ram it through to try to stay at a certain timeline.
Yeah, because I see legislators down there. I have actually helped some of them get aids so they can go through bills for them.
Right.
But it is a problem.
Yeah.
I want to thank.
I think there's a number of states that have full-time legislatures now, and it'd be interesting to compare and contrast what kind of load they have in those states versus not.
Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they would just add more bills in.
Well, that's one of my fears, but yeah.
I want to thank you very much for coming here today. I do appreciate it. I see you're down to your fighting weight.
I am.
So
I'm
you're ready to go.
I am at my running weight right now.
Well,
so we're off. And
we're looking forward to a very serious campaign over the next 2 years, and we wish you a lot of luck. And as you know, we are a conservative newsletter, so we're pulling for you.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for what you do, and it'll be an interesting and hopefully a pleasurable next year and a half.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll be back to you next time.